the Abscondo Podcast. I want to step back today and talk about some of the real basics. Let's start with coronavirus, with COVID-19. I've been suspecting since the outbreak or the beginning of this whole thing back last March that I've been really wondering whether it's real. And I know that they're measuring this specific thing with these tests and they're reporting the numbers, and there was this big thing back then and ever since to report numbers in every country and break it down so much. But then there's this question I had, if there's a pandemic in a country, wouldn't more people than usual die that year? So forget, even counting the cause of death. Let's, continue doing that. That's fine. But if you are a government and you are, the authorities really in charge of figuring this out, I think you'd also want to know your number of total deaths in your, area, your country, whatever. And the fact that they don't count that, traditionally they have these numbers. If you look up, how many people died in the U.S. in 2018, you're going to get to an official number. And apparently those come out later the next year. And that's kind of how it's done around the world. And that's probably because, there was never any urgent need to know that number. But how difficult would it really be to actually count all the people who died this month? Let's say it's March and April. Let's say this becomes the most urgent thing in the world to control coronavirus. I'd want to know, what is the increase? How many more people died in my country total in March and April and May? And I would, as part of the emergency orders, definitely put in a program to make that counting happen. If they're asking the people to shut their businesses and stay home in lockdown and wear masks and everything else and get a vaccine, but they're not willing to do anything different from the government side to actually keep track of that number. And it's a pretty important number. And I wonder why that number is not really ever talked about. Because I've even seen some evidence, and I know there's conflicting information out there naturally because we're in an information war. If you search how many people in, X, Y, and Z country died, total deaths or death rate, in your country, you're going to get some information. And there's a lot of information that would say that there's very little change from 2019 to 2020, which means there's no pandemic, if that's true. And I made this argument in Slovakia. I found a website that said the death rate barely increased. And then people sort of challenging that the official numbers are not out until March or April. And my question is, okay, maybe that's true. I don't know, but why? Why don't they count? It's not that hard to count total deaths. If that's an urgent thing. If they're asking us to stop our lives, maybe they can start counting. And it's the same thing with the election in the U.S. The election was rigged. There's dozens and dozens of excellent lawsuits and presentations, and all the evidence has been brought forth for anyone paying attention since the election until January 6th. And yet, for some reason, the Democrats just didn't want to let anybody look at the ballots. Now, to me, if you're not cheating, you'd say, well, look at the ballots. Here they are. Because it would be true that you won. But it's not true that they won. And if you really had a pandemic, you'd say, yeah, we want the population to know that there's 50% more deaths than usual, total deaths. That's alarming. But that's not what they're going to do because it's not true. If you're being transparent and being honest as a government, you would even publish the names of those people so you could even verify. There would be a concern for being credible when you're asking for such sacrifice. You'd want to make sure that you convince the people that it's all true, especially in a case where so many millions of us around the world don't believe it's true. Now, what do they do instead? They try to censor us. Instead of actually just respecting our question, how many people died in my country last year? It's already the end of January. You should have that information for me, and you should be honest about it. But you don't get that information. And so we question. And as we question, they censor. I probably won't put this version of this podcast on YouTube because I might lose all my content from all the years, all the music and everything else out there. So I have to think about that. So censorship is purely wrong, and everyone knows that. I mean, we've heard about the USSR during communism, how they would censor everyone. You couldn't say anything against the government, or you couldn't say, well, pretty much like it is now, because it is communism now. And so just those facts alone, I mean, you don't need to debate people. You can say how many people died. Why don't they? You don't know. Why don't we know? When it comes to the election, well, why wouldn't they let us see the ballots? Why were they protecting them, and they would not recount the physical ballots anywhere? So, I'm not saying that it's not even a conspiracy. You're just saying, well, naturally, if you did something wrong, and if someone wants to see your email account and you don't show it, you're probably hiding something, right? So, fine, we have that established that many of us have a very good reason not to trust the current authority. But then the question becomes, how do we live under this system? And now we're getting into a more profound, interesting question, actually, because, I've gone through this transformation where I've begun to really question and distrust authority since about 2001 or 2, and I've lived in this way for a long time. And I can tell you that the reason people don't want to listen to so-called conspiracy theories, they don't want to listen to us saying the election was rigged and saying that there's no pandemic, is because it causes so much cognitive dissonance. You can't deal with it emotionally, because if you accept that possibility, like profoundly accept that possibility, it becomes very difficult to go on with your life. Let's be honest. It becomes very difficult to look at your friends and family and neighbors and not have some terrible feelings. Like, for example, now when I see people wearing masks, which is where I live, 95% plus, because it's mandated, I feel as though this situation is only happening because people are so compliant, because people just don't question anything, and that's why it's continuing to happen, and that's the truth. So how do I look at my neighbor, talk to my neighbor, respect my friends and people around me who are not willing to question the reality of the government and why they're torturing people like they are, abusing us? It becomes very difficult to have positive feelings about people around you. Obviously, you're not going to have positive feelings about any of the authorities. And so this is tough. And this is if you're going through an awakening, this is the other side. And I want to first of all start by saying that it's entirely doable to get yourself into a good state despite this. And that's kind of what this whole Abscondo project is about, is kind of talking about this. I'm not really here to convince anyone about election results or pandemics, because to me that's mostly fiction. What I want to do is talk about how to cope and how to survive and thrive and live and be happy and live correctly in a way that's going to bring joy to you and to all those around you, despite the fact that maybe you're not going to be able to do anything about the world's reality. I hope that there are good guys in charge somewhere that are fighting this corruption and this pure, I don't even want to get into describing what I think of people that would do this to a population. But they've been doing this to a population for a very long time. It just gets worse and worse and worse. Excuse me. So how do we live now in this reality where, those of us who want to be honest, we don't want to have that cognitive dissonance, or we don't want to say one thing and believe another. We actually want to be honest and accept that, there's a good argument I just made at the start of this podcast. Why don't we know those numbers? Hey, go down that path and suddenly you find yourself very alone. You find yourself, your view of the world around you changes because you no longer see the lies. You no longer believe in the lies. So what do you do? Well, let's start by talking about how we look at our other people, how we look at other people. I think we can learn to forgive people who believe everything they're spoon-fed by the corporations. We can forgive them because we have to understand from our own experience, we've been through this massive domestication this indoctrination of human beings that takes place from birth, or at least from school age onward. And how can we have any kind of negative feelings or hatred toward people who've been abused by this system? I mean, a system that in many countries, maybe in almost all countries, basically requires mandatory schooling, and all day long, mainly so that adults can go to the factories and go to work. You don't need to spend 7 or 8 hours in school, but that's what you have to do because your parents are not home. So that's how they invented that system. And teaching people things that are not necessarily useful or true. Doing a lot of negative things through school, taking away your curiosity. This is a whole different podcast with schooling, but you look at that fact alone. If you want to be free, fine, but then you have kids, and your kids have to go into this institution, and they tell you how it's going to be with homework and everything else, and what time you've got to be there, and that's not right. That's kind of abusive, and now it's really abusive with the masks and everything else, or forcing kids to be on their computers for most of the day listening to somebody talk. So these neighbors and friends and relatives and everybody else have been through a terrible experiment to indoctrinate human beings. Misinformation in the news, everything that you've just overcome, everything that you've begun to see as a bunch of illusions and lies all through society, all the institutions, all the people in charge, the terrible things they're doing, the corruption of the financial system, the human trafficking, the crimes, the mob, these people who we don't necessarily think about every day or not want to think about, but it exists, and that's who's in charge. And as long as everyone else around us believes in the reality of this system, we're kind of stuck in it to some pretty large extent. For example, as I mentioned, the schooling aspect or the financial aspects, tax. A person's born, they get a number assigned to them, and they have to pay tax to a government. Why? Everything should be optional. I mean, everything should be consensual. For example, sales tax is fine because you decide to buy something. You don't have to buy that thing, but if you do, you pay the tax. That's fine. But income, how can you tax someone for making income? How can the government claim authority over what I do for other people and what I get in return for that? So it's an immoral system, just right fundamentally from the start. And we have to live in it. And why? Because people around us haven't woken up. Because if people did wake up, if the vast majority of people decided to be honest about things, see reality as it is, have a basic sense of fairness and morality about how things ought to be, how they should be more kind and loving and supporting versus punishing and exploitative, we wouldn't tolerate it. We wouldn't do it. We'd find other systems that go outside the institutions to get things done, But I can assure you that wouldn't work right now. And I've tried to do that sort of project to create a virtual economy where people who trust each other can get things done without going through the institutions and all that. And it's a great idea, and it would perfectly work in this corrupt world, but nobody was interested because so few people are awakened. People just think it's easier just to trust what's normal and just go along with everything that's normal. And that's fine. I have no problem with that. The problem I have is when there's no option to live differently. So you should be able to decide as a parent, how you want your child educated, period. If you want to send the kid to the normal school, it's there. If you want to try something totally different, if you have a better approach, you shouldn't have to justify that to the government. You should do it. And the same goes with business and everything else. You shouldn't have to ask for permission to the government because you're not a criminal. There should be basic police and courts and everything, system that people don't do terrible things to other people. And that's the extent of it. So when you see this, how do you live within this system? And it's a question that we all deal with every day, and it's becoming more and more difficult because it's just not acceptable. And there are some things that you can do, but it's never going to be perfect until the world does change. but we have to live here how it is. And that's kind of what my project has been about for the past several years. I've been here for a very long time. And, spiritual awakening, starting with the realization that you're not guilty of anything. You've been part of this terrible system since you can remember, but you're not guilty, and no one else is guilty, because we're all just a result of what this has done to us. So whatever you've done wrong, whatever you currently are doing wrong, look at it truthfully and honestly, but know that you're not guilty, because you can change that. You're not your past. You're not what someone else says you are. You're a good person. Everyone's a good person. And to realize that and to learn to love yourself is to find the origin of what love even is. It flows from within you. It's a feeling you have inside of your inner body. It doesn't come from some other person. You can love yourself and turn that love on yourself and forgive yourself. You're not guilty. You're a good person. And now you feel the sunshine coming through you a little bit. If you've never done this, the first time you do it, I remember the first time that I did this, when I realized, hey, I'm okay. Whatever they say about me, it's not true. And that's the beginning of a spiritual awakening. Now you got to go a little bit deeper than that. You got to look at things like ego and understand, the forces at work and your true identity. Understand the nature of time, the unreality of time. Contemplate the reality of the universe and read about it and think about it, write about it, talk about it. And then you are less subject to the forces in this world. You understand that it's just totally temporary. You're not of the world. You're the universe. You are eternal as consciousness. And understanding this helps you cope with your neighbors, helps you forgive, helps you deal with the world the way that it is. And you go from there. You begin speaking the truth and seeing the power of that. You begin understanding that only love is reality and it has any worth. You stop all forms of attack. You stop defending yourself, You stop trying to be right. And you start creating. You start serving people. And you start considering interesting new ideas. And this, all this, you open your heart and mind to other people. Even if they're different from you, even if they don't know anything about what you think you know, you can see past that because you know that they've just been through what they've been through. That's not them. The truth about all of us is that we're good and perfect underneath all that's been done to us. And they talk about this awakening as some sort of undoing, unlearning, and that's true. I can talk from personal experience. I feel like I've been learning up until about age 30 and then having to unlearn all that since then. And the more that I was able to unlearn what I learned in school, to unlearn what society tells me is true, the more I unlearn, the happier I am, the better things work for me, and the more successful I am, even at my work. What I do, I don't use any of the stuff I learned in college to make money. I learned that all from doing it. So then the question becomes, if you talk about, brainstorming about maybe a different world, I think it needs to be a world where we don't do that to people, where we don't require that you waste most of your life, your best years maybe, being indoctrinated, being brainwashed, and then have to unlearn it all. Let's just start by not learning the wrong stuff. Let's just live in truth from birth. Let's live in truth. So that would be, to me, the world that I want, a world where freedom is everything, where truth and beauty is everything, where love is everything. And none of that damage is done to us. But until then, we're here to cope. We're here to hopefully bring about some change. And if anything that I've said or written has touched you in any way, that's the only reason I'm doing this. And if it has, I think it's everyone's responsibility to carry that forward, because you can touch someone. You can, because I just did, right? So you can too. And we have to heal the world just by telling the truth. We don't have to be right. Just willing to look at the truth and always be honest about it, even if you're wrong. Be loving no matter what, right? Be giving and open to people and tell the truth. And they'll find it interesting, and we'll change things. Because if one day we all wake up and decide that we're not going to, tolerate a system based on lies to enslave us and to force us into submission, and we stop doing it, we win, If one day in Europe, everyone in the country just decides not to wear masks and they go open their business anyway, and they do the same thing tomorrow, there's no way they could punish everyone. They'd have to just change the rules, So it is because people are afraid to, break ranks and speak the truth about the system that it continues. So it is our fault, but it's a result of that system, and it's understandable. So that's why, we have to speak the truth, because it will change some hearts and minds. It will save some people from where they're at. And it's worth doing, even if you get ridiculed and, everything else. It's fine, because what else are we here for? Like, if they're going to erase me from Facebook for saying something, fine. I guess I'm erased anyway if I can't say what I want to say, if I can't say my truth. So being censored, don't censor yourself. Let them censor you, but be smart about it. Be loving. Don't attack people. It's more about the positive truth than the negative attacks, right? That's how you get in trouble. Attacking a powerful person is going to get you in trouble. But speaking the truth about love will never get censored. Okay. Lots of information. I probably left you with head spinning with a bunch of different thoughts and everything. It's probably enough for this podcast. But I'm going to leave you with an Abscondo song. This one is called Strangled into Gray. Thank you for joining me in the Abscondo Podcast.
You get so set on such a narrow line. You do what the teachers say,